What is the most sarcastic and funniest response you've given someone? The legend of Grandpa Joe. Everyone in my family has a story about Grandpa Joe. He was the kind of man you couldn't help but admire, even if he drove you a little crazy sometimes. At 85, Grandpa had lived through more than most people could ever imagine. Wars, technological revolutions, economic downturns, and personal loss. Through it all, his wit remained as sharp as the day he enlisted in the army at 18. He was never one to follow the crowd, and certainly not one to follow conventional wisdom, especially when it came to health. You see, Grandpa Joe was a stubborn man. He'd smoked his first cigarette at 14 and had been hooked ever since. He took his whiskey with no ice and a dash of sarcasm. No one could quite convince him to take life too seriously. My mother used to say, "Dad's going to outlive us all," just to prove a point. And to be honest, we believed her. But what none of us saw coming was the doctor's visit that would turn into a family legend. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon. Grandpa had been feeling fine, better than fine, really, but my mom insisted that he visit the doctor. Just for a checkup, she'd say, to make sure everything's in working order. Grandpa would wave her off with a laugh. "Sweetheart, the only thing that needs fixing around here is your worrying." But as relentless as he was in his ways, my mother was just as persistent. So after a month of nagging, Grandpa finally agreed to go. But there was a catch. His regular doctor had retired. The one who had been treating Grandpa for years had given up trying to make him quit his bad habits long ago. The new guy, though, he didn't know what he was in for. So there he was, sitting in the waiting room of the doctor's office, flipping through an outdated magazine. He eyed the other patients with his typical wry grin, a silent understanding that he didn't belong there with all these sick folks. "This new guy better not try to get too smart with me," Grandpa muttered under his breath. When they finally called his name, he stood up, his old knees creaking just a bit, and made his way down the hallway toward the exam room. Dr. Richards was young, fresh out of med school, with idealism and enthusiasm that came with someone who hadn't yet learned that not everyone can be saved. He extended a hand to Grandpa Joe as he entered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Daniels. How are we feeling today?" Grandpa glanced at the doctor, taking note of the spotless white coat and the look of eager professionalism in his eyes. "Well, Doc," he said with a smirk, "I walked in here on my own 2 feet, so I'd say I'm doing just fine." Dr. Richards chuckled politely, but remained focused. "Let's just run through a few routine questions," he said, glancing at Grandpa's file. "Do you smoke?" "Yep, sure do," Grandpa said without hesitation. "And how often do you drink alcohol?" Grandpa leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Most nights. A couple of fingers of whiskey. Helps me sleep." The young doctor, trying to keep his composure, frowned slightly. "Mr. Daniels, didn't your previous doctor advise you to quit smoking and cut back on drinking?" Grandpa gave a slow nod. "Oh, he sure did. More than once." "Well, I think it's important to follow through on that advice," Dr. Richards said, his voice growing a bit more serious. "These habits aren't doing your body any favors." Dr. Richards began going over more of Grandpa's habits, his diet, his exercise routine, or lack thereof, and his general lifestyle. Each question brought another cautious warning from the doctor, and each warning was met with an indifferent shrug from Grandpa. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Grandpa wasn't going to change his ways. Not now, not ever. The doctor, clearly exasperated, finally leaned forward, eyebrows furrowed. "Mr. Daniels, it seems to me that you've ignored a lot of the medical advice you've been given over the years. Is there anything at all you've done to improve your health?" Grandpa's lips curled into a grin, and for a moment, the room went silent. He leaned in closer, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Well, Doc," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I've outlived my last 2 doctors, so I must be doing something right." Dr. Richards blinked, clearly caught off guard by the response. He sat back in his chair, not quite sure how to respond. For a moment, the weight of Grandpa's words hung in the air, and then the doctor let out a laugh, genuine, surprised laugh. "I suppose you have a point there," he admitted, shaking his head. "But still, I prefer not to join them." Grandpa chuckled too, slapping his knee. "Fair enough, document. But I think I'll keep doing what I'm doing. It's worked out so far." When Grandpa left the office that day, he couldn't wait to tell the story. By the time he got home, it had grown even more colorful. My mom rolled her eyes when he told her, but even she couldn't help but laugh. The story of Grandpa's visit to Dr. Richards became a staple at family gatherings. We'd heard it a dozen times, but it never got old. Each time Grandpa told it, the details became more exaggerated. Dr. Richards became more clueless, and Grandpa became more of a wise old sage who had bested modern medicine with his sharp wit and refusal to follow the rules. It wasn't just the story, though. It was the lesson behind it. Grandpa had always lived life on his own terms, never bending to the expectations or judgments of others. And while we all knew that his habits weren't exactly healthy, there was something admirable about the way he lived, fearless, unashamed, and unapologetic. Of course, as the years went by, Grandpa slowed down a bit. The whiskey bottle gathered dust, and the cigarettes became more of a rare indulgence than a daily ritual. But his spirit remained the same. Even in his final years, when he'd been through more doctors than most people see in a lifetime, he kept his sense of humor and his defiance. Years later, when Grandpa turned 90, he had to go in for another routine checkup. This time, though, it was with Dr. Richards again, now a seasoned professional with a few more gray hairs and a lot more patience. As Grandpa sat in the waiting room, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. He knew the drill by now. Same questions, same advice, same indifference from him. But as the nurse called his name and he stood up, something unexpected happened. A sharp pain shot through his chest. For the first time in his life, Grandpa Joe looked uncertain.